So I'm going to do a very classical sort of like PowerPoint presentation on my field site with some very basic facts about its geography, but also some photographs that I've taken over the various seasons. So you can also see what the interplay of landscape and seasons look like, and also give you a sense of not just the people who live there, but also the other animals that are, non-human animals that they live with. Okay, so my presentation, before I give you my talk from my chapter, is called The Jamuna Chores Through Thick and Thin. As you can see, a boat that really was revolutionized by the fact that, the power tiller that's used for agricultural purposes, that engine was attached to a regular rowing boat, and suddenly they had a high-speed boat, and, has completely changed this part of the world in terms of movement and mobility. Just to give you a sense of where my field work is. So here's a map of Bangladesh, and you can see a big sort of gray stain, that's the Brahmaputra, that then enters into Bangladesh as the Jamuna River and then meets up two other rivers and goes down to the Bay of Bengal. So I was in the area that's marked as Shirajganj, the river there, part of the river there. This is a close-up of Shirajganj, and you can see how the river sort of goes through a side of it, and you can see that this is not an ordinary river. This is a very much of a fragmented, braided river. This takes you even closer to my field site. So these are one of the branches of the river, and that red dot is the village I was at. And as you can see, it's in a pretty large island in the middle of this river. It pretty much serves as a wedge in the island. I would say it's about 10 square miles. And has probably about 20 villages with maybe about 150 to 200 households each. So it's a pretty large island with quite a substantial population. But even though it feels pretty firm in the sense, the size, you can see in the edges that, there's erosion, river coming through parts of it, and then, different parts will fall off and reconstitute at the sides or back on the main area. Okay, so some of the characteristics of the island, of the river, the Brahmaputra, which is, it's a male river in India, but becomes a female river in Bangladesh, right? So I guess it's transgender in that way, is a braided transboundary river. It originates in Tibet, flows through India and Bangladesh before joining the Podda River to become the Meghna River and discharges into the Bay of Bengal. What's interesting about it is that it's not a river of great age. Its current southward direction was the product of earthquakes, notably the Assam, which is fairly north of Bangladesh, earthquake of 1950. So all the sediment built up because of the earthquake made the river that it was at the time, that was going in one direction but go downward to the south, an important source of discharge of sediment and clay. And the sediment is made up of fine sand, silt, and some clay. It's because of the clay that it's able to recongregate and is the basis of the chars. And that's what these islands are called. They're called chars. Bangladesh, is a small country but heavily populated, 174 million people. And the char population is only about 5 million people, but that's still substantial. And 65% of them live on the Jamuna chores. There are other rivers that I also mentioned, and they also throw up land like this, and also the coastal area throws up land. But those are not as well populated as the Jamuna chores. The Jamuna chores have a certain more, they break, they're very erosive as well, but they have a certain more rhythm in their temporality, whereas in the coastal region, there's more inundation, obviously, and in the other rivers, in some ways, the more permanent chores, but they've already been claimed by landowners, people who possess the land. Whereas because the land comes and goes, the ownership of it is always sort of like up in the air and allows people to be able to inhabit it while ownership is up in the air. So the people who live on these shores move quite frequently because of erosion and floods. So of 25% of the families living have moved 3 times over the past 10 years, right? And this was, both what I found, but also referred in this particular work that I cite here. And what was interesting, and as I mentioned this also yesterday, is that, there is a tendency to be quite thickly bound together. And so at the beginning, they tend to move as villages or extended family units, but as land breaks and they have to move further away, and when they can no longer afford to stay together, that's when they start to move in nuclear family units. Okay. So I'll just quickly take you through some photographs to give you a sense of like what the temporality of a chore from maybe a new formation to a slightly more advanced formation looks like. So this would be sort of like the first couple of years of a chore. You can see it's mostly sand, and the man is carrying catkin grass that's probably been planted by him so as to give a little bit more, richness back to the soil to make it more binding for future agriculture. This is what it'll look like in 3 to 4 years. So it's very quick in terms of the vegetation because the soil is quite rich. And as you can see, this is a village, but there aren't other villages. So this is sort of like an early outpost of habitation on a chore. And the other interesting thing to note about these houses is that in the early versions, they're probably made with more impermanent material, like the catkin grass and so on, and jute and so on. And so they'll tend to sort of like perish over time, but they also become nice infrastructure for growing gardens, right? So the whole house is almost also a garden, right? Which I always thought was really an interesting way to think about how house and outside are sort of entwined in these spaces. Okay, but this is, where I live. So as you can tell, it's quite well developed. It's about 20 years into the life of this village, and actually 30 at this point, because I started 10 years ago, so I just had to add that 10 additional years. And you can tell that it is, an old habitation by the fact that it has trees, right? Trees here means that they've been able to grow them over a period of time, and they've had the luxury to be able to grow trees. And then you also see land for pasture, for cows, for goats, and so on. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of what it looks like at a different season. And now just to give you a quick sense of like how erosive the space is. So this is what the soil looks like, a certain cross-section of it. And when I show this to my colleagues in the geology department, they always remark on the fact that this is soil without any structure as such, right? And you can see how fresh this area is in terms of erosion, because some of the grass is already also falling over. Okay, so the other interesting thing about erosion is that unlike floods, which has a sort of like 5-year, 10-year temporality, erosion just happens. It's like a continuous all-year thing. There's something not evented about it, right? And so as a result, it doesn't get the kind of attention, definitely not from the state, but also from people. So, like a family will move away and the people will remark on it a month later. They're like, where's that family, And so it's quite interesting how it's like erosion keeps people constantly moving, right? And so here you see that the first things that people will try to save in the occasion of the erosion are their trees, right? Because the house they can bring down very quickly, but trees take, bringing people together and actually cutting them down, and they really loathe to lose trees. So this is, just to give you a sense of like how ordinary erosion is. This is of a paddy field, where a day before the whole place was covered, and then like a day later there was like a little break, and this by the 3rd day I decided, oh my God, I better take a picture because this is happening quite rapidly. By the 3rd day, ducks had moved in, so it was. Yeah, so this is what this is how people will live while if there is erosion happening, and they take usually, you know, they live with the relatives. Relatives give their lands for people to pitch at least their roof till they find sort of like more permanent housing, and at least underneath this they will store their stuff till they can find another place to move to. So this is, you know, these are sort of like more the typical pictures that you see of Bangladesh, which is of floods. And, you know, these are the ones that will make sort of like international, national media. But I wanted to show you, it was this other thing, this slow erosion, that is sort of like the thing that actually produces more movement and displacement than the occasional flood. Okay. This is what drought, you know, like in the winter months, water, the same sort of like river would be totally full, you know, goes away. But also it's a time, it's not a time of necessarily, you know, I mean, it's a drought in the sense that it's a dry season, but, you know, there's still plantation going on. And then just to give you a sense of like all the other animals that they live with before I actually give you a section of my chapter. So, you know, cows, and, you know, cows are said to experience more heat and cold than humans. And so a lot of attention is paid to make sure that they are comfortable. Chickens, not that much attention is paid to them, unfortunately. And they very often fall prey to foxes. Pigeons. Pigeons are incredibly interesting because they get very attached to a place, and so if you have to move your house, you have to actually bind them in their house, and you have to discombobulate them so that they get reoriented to a new place, right? They're very, very emotionally attached to their previous place of location. Ducks, goats, fish, lots of fish from the rivers, and then of course, you know, the sheep. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of this milieu, so that you didn't think that it was all sort of like, you know, as depressing as some of the things I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. Is that okay? Okay, I sort of, you know, looked at a word counter to see how, you know, how much is 30 minutes. So I'm just going to stop at those words, at that exact number. Okay, so Ensouling Hunger, Religious Perspectives on Everyday Food Insecurity in the Jamuna Chores. One of the outcomes of the COP23 meetings in Bonn in 2017 was the decision to move forward with mitigating the climate-related effects of agriculture, especially the emissions of non-carbon trace gases, methane and nitrous oxide, and adapting agriculture to changing climate regimes. As the discussion on this outcome frankly states, after a decade of decline in global hunger, it was rising again. The specter of food insecurity and hunger intensified into famines haunted this discussion. Hunger is a part of your everyday life and resides in the body. I was alerted to this when I asked some boys with whom I was playing a game of Ludo to excuse me because I was hungry and wanted to get us some food. They were quite shocked that I would stop playing for hunger. Is your stomach biting? Pet kamraite se? Asked one, evoking an image of the stomach biting its way out. Tell it to be quiet. Show some tolerance or patience, dhorjo for it, said another. This was my first realization that everybody around me went through their days in a state of suppressed hunger. Moreover, they addressed it as a distinct being that inhabited their bodies and over which they had to assert control in the manner of the unruly nafs, or the willful or carnal soul within Islamic conceptions of the body. But they also referred to it by its ball or force, or tej, or intensity. Furthermore, in the semantic overlap between hunger, force, and intensity within Bangla, there was a fourth word that mapped onto the three, that of desire or akankha or prerana, such that hunger exhibited force and intensity hunger also shaded into desire, and force-yielded desire is one of its meanings. This shading corresponded to chore dwellers' descriptions and commingling of two kinds of hunger, the hunger of the stomach, peter khida, and a deeper metaphysical hunger that is not usually easily sated, sometimes inadequately referred to as the hunger of the eye, chokher khida, or greed, or better yet, as becoming stomach. Several aspects of the chore dwellers' way of talking about hunger are noteworthy. The description of hunger, particularly the language of force and intensity, made it out to be less within a contained self and more a biophysical event within a field of forces. There were several cognate conditions and actions within chore lives that point to the imagination of the body as buffeted by forces. The concept of batash laga, or catching the wind, is a common chore expression to indicate the source of a variety of conditions from mental illness to paralysis. It suggested a body porous and vulnerable to ill intent. Yet Dom Noah, or taking breath, was also a very powerful motif in its own right, deriving from myriad sources, but most notably from Baul philosophy, in which to breathe is to draw in life and to set one's insides on fire. Breath was literally an ignition for the soul. The interplay of the body as a boat or vessel buffeted by every wind and water currents, and the body as a bellows that kept alive the embers of the soul, made for an interesting imagery of dynamical environments embedded within and interacting with further dynamical environments. Thus, the persistence of hunger among the choras, those who live on chores, the semantic field around the word and the cognitive condition to hunger alerted me that hunger was not a simple deprivation of food, but an event in relation to other events, including floods, erosion, and lightning. It placed the body within a wide field of forces that transected it. Furthermore, insofar as these forces were themselves historically, politically, and societally structured, it suggested that hunger was also so structured. For instance, the studied relations of my young friends to hunger, depicted earlier, suggested a long prehistory of experiencing and modulating one's behavior in relation to it. Hunger in this present enfolds the past to help us understand not only how the future will be experienced, but also how it can serve as an indication of what climate change augurs with the possibility of food insecurity. Within this exploration, the metaphoric uses of hunger to describe the motility of desire and to judge oneself and others suggest hunger's availability for rendering political and metaphysical judgments and for deepening our insights into the possible ravages of sociality. This paper traverses the everyday experiences and expressions of hunger in the Jamuna chores to draw out an uncertain future of food insecurity, the overtaking of hunger by malnourishment, and a deep feeling of insatiability over the course of the Green Revolution in Bangladesh, and the ever-present struggles to manage a bottomless, more metaphysical hunger through spiritual work. So, memories of hunger. Hunger crisscrossed everyday life, entangled with memories of past instances of going hungry, sometimes brought on by the sight of what is called distress foods. Even within these tangled recollections of hunger, usually tied to seasonal hunger during lean times or monga, or misfortunes, durbhiko, arising from natural disasters, durjog, there were particular ones that seemed inassimilable to seasonality or natural disasters, bearing with them an element of abnormality. These were attributed to the hahakar, which literally meant lamentation or a wail, and was used to describe the famine that befell the working poor in the cities and the countryside in 1974, a few years after Bangladesh won its independence from Pakistan. This hahakar was widely remembered by anyone over the age of 40. In their description of the times, hunger emerged as a scourge that threatened to wipe away their humanity, reducing them to their haunches or to their sides, unable to do anything. Amartya Sen, the development economist, in his book Poverty and Famine, argues against the standard explanation that it wasn't a sudden fall of grain stocks that led to the 1974 famine, but rather the stockpiling of it and the rise of food prices. Had people the money, they would have found food to buy, but failing that, they starved. While the Mujib government's initial denial of starvation deaths intensified the famine situation, it is noteworthy that Bangladesh was quite ravaged by the Pakistani army in 71, with crop fields burnt, infrastructure destroyed, and the country's foreign credit at a low. Moreover, despite Mujib's urging, the US withheld food aid in order to penalize Bangladesh for selling jute bags to Cuba, then already under economic sanction. It was the working poor who bore the brunt of the famine, many of them deserting families and homesteads to migrate to the cities for work or food and dying on the streets there. Despite the suppression of the famine of 1974 within official historiography in Bangladesh, a new nationalist orientation emerged from the country's experience of famine, which was to prevent famine at all costs. The government of Bangladesh made investments in the introduction of Green Revolution technology packages consisting of high-yielding varieties of rice seeds, irrigation through tube wells, and cocktails of fertilizers and pesticides. Although the Chor dwellers were quite marginalized within the national economy, they too had benefited from the economic shifts in the areas of agriculture. Monga or seasonal hunger was much reduced in these parts, whereas previously Chor dwellers had to sell their labor in advance of the laboring season to acquire some cash to help them through lean times. Now they readily told me that they no longer felt compelled to do so. Chora spoke with a split voice about the Green Revolution. As mentioned above, they constantly remarked on the fact that there was sufficient rice now grown at present to feed all of Bangladesh, and told me proudly that no one went hungry anymore. At the same time, they complained volubly that their food lacked pushti or nutrition, suggesting their assimilation of the latest public health discourse. They shivered at the ungodly sizes of their vegetables, made gargantuan by fertilizers, but which they considered to lack in shad or taste. And they well understood the effects of pesticides on their body to be akin to the bish or poison of foods illegally dumped with chemicals such as formaldehyde. Their words pointed to a shift in the placement of the abnormal from outright starvation as the limit of the normal, a sign of the abnormal, to the abnormal now entrenched as the new normal. A deep nostalgia for rice grains of old abounded. And in fact, even the distressed foods that were eaten in the early famine times were now treated as things that brought back memories of the past, of a very, of a past of food with a lot of nourishment. Okay, so now the next section is called the wedding feast, or the metaphysics of hunger. We see how, you're moving from hunger that's attached to famine to hunger that's now a kind of dissatisfaction with the food that's been coming out of the Green Revolution, and then we move to a kind of metaphysics of hunger. To remind the reader, Sen, in his studies of famine, showed how natural disasters compound suffering, but mass starvation was not related to either disasters or food shortages, but to the growing lag between actual wages and food prices. The loss of ability to buy food was a stronger trigger for famine than the depletion of food supplies. Sen's point is that there were too many mediating factors between natural disasters and the inability of a seasonal wage laborer to buy food to assume linear causal links between them. I would like to heed Sen's directive that we attend to the mediating structures, lest we render them invisible. The representation of the Bangladeshi politician as a man with a big stomach is a persistent image within Chor discourse, which offers us one figuration of a mediating structure. In early July in 2012, I attended the wedding feast of a politician's son in Belkuchi Upazila, Shirajganj, which is in the mainland, and a short boat trip from the village I live in, Dokhin Teguri. The politician was Muhammad Abdul Latif Bishash, who had started his political career through the lowest level of government, climbed his way to the Upazila level and then the Zilla Porishod before being elected to the parliament and selected by the then Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, thank God she has gone, to become the Minister of Fisheries and Livestock, a ministry reputed to be as corrupt as those of water, land and forestry. Now, his son was getting married, and Latif Bishash had invited all those close to him, notably those in the local chapters of the political party, the Awami League, numbering in the thousands. There was to be an elaborate wedding feast in a factory building in Belkuchi, and for which red invitation cards ornamentally decorated in gold script were required for entry. Wajid Bhai, who was well entrenched within the local networks of the political party, Awami League, proudly secured for me one of these coveted wedding cards, and off we went from Dokhin Teguri by boat to Belkuchi. There were scores of men with us, dressed in whatever nice clothes they owned, synthetic plants, long kurtas and closed shoes. Some of the men chose to travel separately from us so as to be able to smoke a joint or drink homemade liquor. This was to be a grand roiling time, as everyone was going to get plenty to eat. The banquet hall was filled with round tables covered in maroon silky cloth. There were long tables along the side of the room groaning under the weight of food. There were bearers in the same maroon fabric bringing out bowls of food to each table. I kept beside Wajid Bhai and a few others from Dokhin Teguri. We seated ourselves in one of the round tables. We did not know the others at our table and acknowledged them by giving and receiving nods, sitting amiably together. Although the bowls of rice, lentils, vegetable, and chicken curry were soon depleted, we made sure to pass the bowls around the table after we individually served ourselves and offered the bowls to others before having seconds. After this food was eaten, I thought we were done, but then noticed the bearers coming out with further steaming bowls of food. A rustle of excitement went through the enormous room, which even at its first seating of guests held close to 2,000 people. I realized that all that we had eaten was just the first course to prime us for the main course. Perhaps the first course had been served to slake our hunger so that we might attend to the main course with decorum, but that wasn't to be. The bowls bore meat, especially chunks of beef, cooked in a rich-looking curry. Unlike the first course, during which we politely passed around the bowls of food after taking our individual portions, here people at our table proceeded to pour the bowls delivered to their table almost entirely onto their plates. The first person to serve himself stood up while doing so to prevent others from wresting the bowl from him. Others stuck out their elbows while serving themselves, muttering "Kayaloi," which translates as "let me finish eating," but this was understood in the more aggressive sense of "let me eat the most I can." Gravy sloshed onto the floor and was ignored, as the focus was entirely on the chunks of beef. No one looked up from his plate to see the others at the table. Those at the end of the circle, including myself, never got any meat, despite several bowls being delivered to our table. Wajid Bhai struggled to secure a bowl for us from the passing bearers, and upon failing, shrugged in frustration, telling me that this was the khai, eat and eat nature of Bengalis, generally interpreted to mean focused on only the present and only on oneself. I had a visceral sense of two important expressions that I had heard prior. In one, the person who told me this expression said of the rich, even those related to her by blood, che dakhena, they don't even look up to see us, or they look but cannot see us. There was some element of this refusal to look up, to acknowledge the claims of others upon the common pot of food, in the refusal by the men to share the meat at the feast. And another more significant instance, my friend who was known for giving me expressions, she was interviewed by a TV station about whether she wanted local elections or not for her village, that she claimed was only temporarily under the water. It was no longer there, but just to, as a little aside, lots of the villages, even though they're underwater, still hold elections so that they can have politicians who can then be around when the villages actually emerge from the water, when the land actually comes up. As she related to me afterward during the interview, she said, the journalist asked me, do all of you want the local elections? I said forcefully, yes, we want elections. For 10 years, they, meaning the politicians, have been eating. Aren't there other human beings who deserve to eat? Don't we also want to eat? I want elections. Here she made a direct link between what they or politicians do and eating, or rather gorging to an excess, with the hint of this excess carried by her words. For 10 years they have been eating. And she made claims upon a democratic politics based on voting by stating forcefully that the poor have a right to be voted in, or to vote in those they support, so they can eat too, perhaps even eat to an excess. Consequently, it should not surprise that one of the most strident critiques of politicians and local leaders was that they had become one large pate or stomach. It called for the rigors of practicing non-eating or spiritual fasts to keep such hunger under control. So my next section, feeding and the ensouling of hunger. Rajak, member of Choria Fasil village, was a powerful leader hailing from a strong Gushti or kinship network. Even though Rajak member's village was now underwater and he had ceased to be a member of the local government, he could still deliver votes in mass. Rajak member was a tall and gangly man with a pale complexion, unusual for these parts, suggesting a protected life largely led in the shade. There were none more protective of him than his wife Shurjo Bano, who presided over Rajak member's multi-generational family. On the Friday I went to spend with her. She had gotten up before sunrise to cook and eat rice. She was fasting for her husband's ailing health, as he was a heart patient. She had declared her intention to fast on 12 consecutive Fridays, and this was her 4th day of fasting. She fasted in the midst of cooking, laboring, and feeding an enormous family. Shurjo told me matter-of-factly that she had gotten up before the sun, she had cooked and eaten, making sure to cook enough for the rest of the family. Then she bundled up some food for her 2 eldest sons who were going to Makra, an area up north, to work as day laborers on rice husking grounds. She walked them to the boat to advance them on their journey. Her second son usually served as a milkman, but was now en route to Makra, so she walked to the 6 houses at which her son owed money for the milk he had bought off them. She also collected milk from 4 more houses for her youngest son, who was off from school, so he could carry the milk to the mainland by the boat reserved for the ghoshes, those who deliver milk. She went back home and milked the 6 cows that she herself had, handing to each of the cows her calf to encourage the milk to spurt. This milk too she added onto her youngest son's shoulders. As others partook of the pot that she had cooked as they got up, Shurjo was already thinking of the next meal for the family. In front of the house there was a huge pagar, or hole, from which soil had been scooped up to raise the households in the area. Shurjo descended into the hole to catch fish. It was quite a sight to see her fish with 2 kinds of nets, one for catching big fish and one for smaller ones. Other villagers who gathered to watch as she coordinated her actions with her remaining son. That the focus was the fish rather than the drama of fishing became evident as the first few fish were caught and put in a water-filled pot, which quickly became the center of attention of the people gathered. As soon as a decent number of fish had been caught, some 10 of them, of about 1.5 feet each, they were divided among the 5 households that claimed the watering hole as their own and had probably released some of the fishes into it as spawn. Shujo carried out the division with a representative from each household sitting around the pot to keep tabs. This division of fishes left Rajak member's house with 3, with 2 to be eaten for lunch and 1 to be saved for dinner. While the eldest daughter-in-law cooked the fish for the afternoon meal, Shujo continued on her intense pace of working, seeking out and medicating one of the cows suffering from SER, or loose motion. With 4 men holding the enormous cow, Shujo mashed and mixed with water 3 enormous pills that then she poured down the cow's gullet. With the cooking complete and everyone in the household bathed and cleaned after the morning of the usual labors, caring for the elderly, grandmother cleaning the household, repairing the edges of the individual buildings with mud mixed with cow dung, tending to cows and sheep, gathering the dung, playing, etc., Shujo now squatted on the floor of the main tin room of the house, gathered her family around her, and served their food in their individual dishes. Then Shujo sent some pieces of fishes to her neighbor, who was a widow with young children. She even gave some food to the mentally ill woman from the house next door and an abandoned child in the neighborhood who showed uncanny knack for knowing when to appear. And then she watched as everyone ate. Shujo's food-deprived body would seem to recall that of poor women in rural households who were said to eat only at the conclusion of everyone else's meal and only what is left. And her fasting lent evidence to a long-established concern among development workers and public health officials that women and young girls were more underfed and malnourished than men and young boys in rural families. But there has been an interesting evolution in these oft-noted tendencies, with women of the chore now claiming to eat more rice than men because they had to labor more within the households than before. And due to the NGO encouraged home gardening, livestock rearing, and artisanal work. Also noteworthy was that young girls got more food than boys. The functionalist reason trotted out was that with the rise of the demand for dowry in marrying girls, parents hoped that if their girls were well fed and good looking, lower dowries might be demanded of them. So I just have one more page to read, and hopefully that will conclude my talk. Sorry about it being so full of details. What was interesting in Shujo Bano's fasting was not that she was spiritualizing a possibly ordinary event of food deprivation, but that she was actually denying herself food in the midst of feeding others and undertaking her daily labors to actively accrue spiritual merit to transfer to her husband. This was a small but telling shift. In a place where everyone considered themselves to be in God's favor because they were so poor and their lives so filled with hardship that it awoke God's compassion, a woman voluntarily fasting to protect her husband suggested a husband vulnerable to corruption and need of additional spiritual support than poverty alone provided. Indeed, when Shujo finally stopped to rest in the middle of the afternoon, she let down her guard to say that she worried for her husband's health because he was so caught up in dunyadari or worldly affairs. Within the wider discourse of the metaphysical hunger of politicians, it was as though being a politician opened Rajak member up to a hunger that could consume him, and Shujo Bano's spiritual fast served to keep it at bay. But it wasn't only the abstaining from food or roja rakha that was spiritualizing, it was also the giving of food. The Choras considered themselves so poor as to deserve zakat, which is the Islamically enforced almsgiving. They saw themselves as the takers of zakat, while others met the criteria of wealth to be religiously obligated to give it. So when chorus gave a neighbor a few pieces of fish or a passing beggar a fistful of rice, it wasn't done with zakat in mind, but rather sadaqah, the voluntary charity that was given out of compassion or love. And it wasn't only in instances of giving food to the obviously needy that sadaqah was at work, but in inviting others to eat with oneself when one barely had enough food. Often people passing households were greeted and swiftly asked to join in meals, and more often than not such invitations were declined, but not before a fistful of puffed rice, a piece of molasses, or a dry cut of coconut had been pressed into their palms. When I asked Shujo Bano, who was perhaps the most generous of all and insisted on frying for me squash blossoms, why people invited and why those invited refused, I was told "Attake bachaye rakhte hobe," which is roughly translated as "the soul has to be kept alive." This wasn't quite the calculative logic deployed by mosque leaders or madrasa students who urged passerbys to donate to build mosques and madrasas so as to build themselves homes in heaven. Rather, it was a concern for the soul's survival in this world. And if in the first instance, Shujo Bano fasted to secure her husband's health, to provide him spiritual strength against an ailing body and the metaphysical threats that haunted politicians, those who made offers of food did so with some awareness of the standing threats to their own soul. I was interested to understand how the soul's survivability hinged on food. Within common conception of the human soul in Islamic philosophy, there are both animal and plant parts to it, in addition to the metaphysical parts. To feel hunger was to become plant or animal, or to have one's plant or animal part predominate. To take food and to offer food was a necessity so as to prevent one's domination by these sentient but unreflective parts, but also moral imperative insofar as the plant and animal part of one's soul and those of others had a right to food, and only with food could the soul ensure its life. Thus, rather than thinking of the invitation to partake in food as compassion or love to enable the flourishing of one's individual soul, as a good merit to accumulate, or as a banking of favors for an uncertain future, I see it as part of a collective address to hunger as a trace of the soul in everyone. To refuse such invitations of food was not to deny the soul, but simply to acknowledge that its various fractious parts were under control or within acceptable limits of deprivation. Furthermore, seeing hunger as the trace of the soul was not unlike seeing it as a biophysical event, as I have been suggesting. In both, hunger indexed an personal force within one that aligned one within different fields, as soul within the spiritual field, and as weather within that of elemental forces and seasonal variation, with both fields considered the same at certain points in chore expression when they understood weather as a divine phenomenon. Thank you.